Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the LeftPOC Project, which brings you the history of leftists of color, one swipe at a time. And this is the LeftPOC Project podcast. On today's episode, Richard and I have a bit of a news recap to discuss some of the things going on at the moment and express some of our disappointment and frustration with those things. Anyway, enjoy. Hi everyone. Hi, Richard. How are you?
Hello. I'm doing all right.
Good. As per usual, nowadays, I have to do a little bit of a disclaimer and just let everyone know that you may well indeed hear my baby in the background. She's 9.5 months now, almost 10, going on 50, apparently, in her assertiveness. She tends to talk a lot, yell a lot, etc. So you may hear her in the background. You may also hear my dog. So just giving everyone a heads up. This is the nature of podcasting with a family. So anyway, sorry about that. Today's episode, we're actually going to be doing sort of a news update, general discussion / assessment of the world. I've been deviating a bit from doing some of the typical history podcasts and interviews only because it's been very difficult for me to sit down and actually do the invitation scheduling, and also just in recognition of the fact that it's the holiday time, holiday season. Professors, academics, and activists also have personal lives, and they're trying to relax and take a breather, or they're super busy in preparation for that time off. So I'm just respectful of that, and also just bearing in mind that right now, because of the pandemic, home life is office life, is school life, it's everything. And I recognize that parents in particular are really taxed trying to work from home and also take care of their kids and any other household and family needs that they're managing and juggling. So just bearing that in mind and understanding and, respecting that fact. So we will go back to having interviews soon, but just giving everyone a heads up as to why or not a heads up, but I guess a postscript of sorts, I don't know what the word is, but letting everyone know, an explanation maybe is the word I'm looking for, as to why we haven't had as many live guests lately. It's a mix of my own personal obligations, being tired, being busy, and also out of respect for those of others. But yeah, we're coming back on that front very soon. Okay, now with all of that out of the way, I also just wanted to do another little layer of housekeeping to remind everyone to please subscribe on the Patreon page, and that's patreon.com/LeftPOC. You can donate for $1 or more. You can also subscribe to the podcast for free. All this stuff is free always, but the donation is always welcome. You can subscribe to the podcast on anywhere where you get your podcasts, so iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, all those places. There's a laundry list of these services now. So any of them, we're there, except for the ones that charge you money. So we're not interested in any of those, and we don't. I don't think we're being picked up by any of those, but yeah, we wouldn't charge you any money to listen to us talk about stuff. And also just make sure that you follow us on social media. So we're pretty active on Twitter and Facebook, and we'll have some new things coming out on that front very soon. So keep a lookout on that front. And yeah, okay, enough with the housekeeping. Let's get on with the world. Richard, why don't you start us off? I know you wanted to talk and had some things ruminating upstairs in your mind about what's going on lately. So yeah, you feel free to open us up with your talking points.
Oh, well, I guess there's just kind of do a broad recap a little bit. There's just been a lot in 2020. And I mean, I guess throughout the last few years, really, the Trump administration as it is coming to an end, or at least that's what what we're expecting. And I guess it's been a wild ride and a lot of experiences for me, a lot of learning and a lot of just kind of I guess growing personal level and also just a more formal educational level, like is with this podcast and with other experiences and kind of reaching out to broader communities and so on and so forth. So I feel like I've broadened my horizons quite a bit recently, and so I've started to hear more news stories from around the world. The Indian protests and for the farm workers has been a big one that's been going on lately that I think fits to talk about. And I guess some of the other things that I've been thinking about have been just politically how to move forward from here. Where are we at? I was looking back at kind of the podcast catalog and noticed it was about this time a year ago when we read Mao, and at this time now we're on the verge of a bunch of eviction protections and all of that falling away, and a lot of people either being pushed into the streets, and they're already being dragged out into the streets by police in various states. And I just I think it's interesting how I guess proper the timing has been for that growth. It gave me time to kind of internalize and understand what else was there behind Mao besides just kind of the headline distaste with landlords, I guess I'll go with. And so I guess those two things are the kind of things that have stuck out with me the most at this moment, are the massive suffering that we see along with coronavirus, and then leading into what's a lack of protections and funding so that people can stay in their homes leading into this next year, as well as the massive uprisings we see by workers internationally, specifically most recently in India.
Yeah, that's a good, I mean, a short list, but a very fulfilling one, I think, of things to discuss. It's interesting that you bring up the Mao recording because I'm like looking at my living room and remember sitting there reading and discussing this with you. And it makes me sad because it was like the time before. Like that's what I've been calling everything pre-coronavirus pandemic, you know, like this was a little bit before all of that got ramped up. And yeah, it's interesting, like reflecting back on that. It seems like it was just yesterday we recorded that, and it was a year ago. Um, yeah, I think for me, the thing that's been on my mind the most is just kind of I've been trying to pay attention to these appointments that are being made by Biden. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think that there's been, at least on the part of the mainstream press, a rather you know, like happy, content, even if not congratulatory tone being taken by them, and especially because you know, Biden is taking advantage of putting in a lot of quote unquote firsts, while at the same time making sure those firsts are like really rapacious in their neoliberal politics and like if not like right wing, to be honest, straight up right wing politics, especially when it comes to foreign policy and whatnot. And so that's been frustrating me. At the same time, I think, you know, what we're seeing from some elements of the left, at least what I loosely call the online left, or what loosely formed, I should say, the online left, is the fact that there's been a lamentation of the diversity within this group. And they've been focusing on that in some ways, sometimes more than the actual harm that they'll cause. So like there's a bit of language around like, oh, this is identity politics, this and that. Like, and what ends up happening is I think that they get bogged down in like dissecting the weaponization of identity politics, and then like that takes up 90% of the conversation, as opposed to like what that person is actually going to do or potentially do in office, or like their record. You know what I mean? So while I understand that they're trying to refute, you know, this reliance on the kind of superficial approach to diversity as an answer to, you know, like hiring issues and stuff in executive positions, what they end up doing is they ignore, you know, and I don't think it's intentional, but they end up ignoring or kind of decreasing the degree of the discussion that could and should be had about what these people's records are and what they're going to do or potentially do when in office. And then more so, especially as it relates to the people of color and women, for example, that they may actually end up harming, or most likely will harm, to be quite honest, in their position. And I think that there's been a sort of disproportionate focus on personalities. So like Neera Tanden, everyone knows Neera Tanden is terrible, and Neera Tanden said this and that and was acting up on Twitter and whatnot. And she said certain things in video about being against, saving Social Security and social programs and things like that, quote unquote entitlements, as they're called by neoliberals. But like, okay, and everyone's just kind of showing the same footage and saying the same things, but like, there's got to be a little bit more depth at this. And I think the focus is like on Neera, because Neera is such a personality, a sort of acceptable person to hate on the left, which, I mean, I'm with them, like I obviously have issues with her and her politics, but I think that like sometimes, as I said, I think people get wrapped up in trying to kind of tear down one person and then they miss the forest for the trees. And I think what we're seeing is, what's beginning to shape up as a very, very, very dangerous, threatening group of people in very many elements of the government. I mean, in some cases, literally the people that a lot of people on the left were like, do not appoint this person, or like, don't even consider appointing this person. And then he ends up appointing. So like the agricultural department is a good example of that. The guy that he put in place, or initially, like some people were pushing for Marcia Fudge, who's a representative from Ohio, a Black woman, and somewhat progressive. I mean, by the standards that we have in Washington right now, she's a progressive. But she had been, seen as sort of a favorite for that pick, and then was critical of the typical appointments of Black officials to head groups like HUD, or departments like HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, or Labor, if I'm not mistaken. And she ended up getting put as the head of HUD. And so there's some discussion about, okay, we're adding people of color, we're adding women of color, but then are they still sort of reifying the old stereotypes and placing a limit on what people can do, what position and why? And at the same time, I would say hiring people for positions that are incredibly scary, especially related to foreign policy, that have a history of harming people abroad. And, like, what do those records look like? And further, what can we do to stop it? And I think, like, I mean, I don't have answers to that personally, but I question the degree of power that we have on the left, especially when it comes to foreign policy appointments. I think for domestic stuff, there's some safety net because, ironically, because the Republicans will reject a lot of people that Biden is going to appoint or try to get passed through the confirmations. But I don't see them rejecting his foreign policy people. And yeah, I mean, I'm kind of like, I don't know what that's going to look like. And, they might, like Mitch McConnell and et al., like they might just reject everybody on out of principle, that, oh, okay, it's a Biden pick, so we're going to reject them. We're not going to confirm them. But, I wonder, like, are they going to reject any of these people? Because at the end of the day, Republicans and Democrats, they tend to have the same objectives when it comes to foreign policy, which is scary, and because it always goes in a right-wing direction.
No, yeah, I think those are interesting points, and I think they tie into some of the other things that have come up as well in the past year or so. And the picks in particular, you mentioned that, kind of, and Biden said this as well, wants his cabinet to look like America. But in that kind of shallow presentation, he's falling short even there, where Clyburn has been disappointed in his picks so far. And I think a chairperson for the API group in Congress also recently was said that they wanted a secretary or a cabinet level representation and basically got shot down by the Biden team.
Yeah.
And so they're not even meeting that superficial level of putting people that look like the people that they want to put this terrible policy in place against or whatever. They so they're falling short. He's falling short even of that bar from the people that aren't even holding him to, I would say, a leftward contention at all. Just essentially just expecting a return for the favors that they've provided for him politically. And Clyburn speaking up and essentially cinching the South for Biden and potentially really clinching the nomination along with the consolidation encouraged by Obama.
Mm-hmm.
And then as well as I don't know I haven't looked specifically at the polling recently, but I imagine Biden's support was strong among Asian Pacific Islanders at least comparatively to Trump, and so there's an expectation that even if it's for nothing else but support and voting in the traditional sense, there's an expectation that if we're going to support you, that you're going to then give us representation and at minimum a seat at the table. I, for one, am kind of worn out or tired of the perspective of looking for a seat at what I see as a rigged table, particularly when you find out that when you get to that seat, your job is to essentially just nod and repeat whatever the person that got that seat for you there expects you to say. And if and when you ever deviate from that, you'll be expelled and somebody else will be put in that seat, and they'll remind you constantly whenever you think about speaking up that there's always a bunch of people ready to take your place. And so the idea that you then shift things from the inside never seems to work out, at least for the people that I've seen have recently over the last 5 or 10 years come to the realization that hasn't been working for them.
I mean, one of the best versions of that seat at the table metaphor I heard was, I don't know who said this, but I heard that, do you really want a seat at the table if you're the one being served as the dish, and I think that that's a good way to put it, because ultimately, this is a sort of self-cannibalizing process for a lot of these people, and insofar as they see themselves as part of the collective, right? I think on the surface many do, right? Obviously people who are up for these positions who identify as Black or female or whatever do identify as a member of that community, insofar however you want to define community, but in the popularly defined way. But at the same time, their interests are very different oftentimes from the vast majority of the community and or the community that they purport to represent and support. So there's a big gap between, the average Black citizen and voter versus the Black people that are being appointed to these positions who have Ivy League backgrounds and or who've worked in government service forever, or who are wealthy. And, some of these are ands as opposed to ors. But I think that disconnect is very real. But, they, in at the same time, there are some people who've come from the bottom, who've come through public schools, who've dealt with, government aid their whole lives, who came from families who were immigrant groups, et cetera. And they, at the same time, once they get to those higher positions, they cut the ladder from under them, right? They, instead of helping other, and Neera Tanden is a very good example of this, because she often talks about how her mother was an immigrant. Her family, she comes from a family of immigrants from India, and then they relied on welfare and food stamps and things like this to survive. And then, she's often going along with the administration that she's representing, at least when she worked for the Center for American Progress, to go against those programs. We also see this with Kamala Harris, and I've mentioned this. I don't remember if I mentioned it on this podcast, but I've definitely mentioned it elsewhere and written, tweeted about it, talked about it in passing. But she also, she comes from immigrant background. Both of her parents are immigrants. Her sister had a child before, not being married. She was very young when she had her daughter, and, relied on family and the support of others to get her through life. And then graduated and, went on to become a very prominent member of the Democratic Party. I'm talking about her sister right now. But Kamala also, arguably has dealt with some adversity, at least just as a part of that family unit. And she doesn't seem to, I personally don't understand it, but she doesn't seem to connect back to people who are going through similar things that her family went through when she was younger. And I think that, again, this is just me talking for myself, but, I have experiences in my life that made me more sympathetic, if not empathetic, to certain circumstances of other people. And I, instead of looking at them and saying, why didn't you make it? Why aren't you doing like I did? Whatever. Like, not that I've made it, but you know what I mean? Like, why aren't you, more financially stable, or why aren't you trying to get an education, or why aren't you? And instead of asking those questions, I'm saying to myself, like, what is still happening? What is ongoing in your life that's making getting those things difficult for you? And how can I help? Like, how can I help sustain you right now? And I think that's the question that, like, these kinds of people aren't asking. They're looking further into ways of, like, how they can destroy. And it's something that it's a type of tokenism that I see on all levels of the political spectrum. But there's like this need for some people to be the only fill in the blank group person in the room, So I want to be the only Black woman in the room. I want to be the only LGBTQ identified person in the room. I want to be the only Asian American person in the room. And in the process of doing that, they exclude, harm, and alienate people from the group that they once called home, or from which they came. And it's a very disturbing practice, but it's something we see all the time, and something that unfortunately the Democratic Party continues to maintain, to like sustain as part of their political message. And what I'm concerned about is, and I see it getting worse and worse, actually, I'm very concerned that soon the understanding will be that if you see a Black face, if you see a woman, if you see any sort of like, a sort of like an embrace of diversity, which I think is necessary for, at least in terms of having diverse experiences. If you see an embrace of that, there's like a negative political and especially economic and foreign policy side to follow. That concerns me, because I don't want and this is also a concern I had with regard to like the constant language around Black women being the backbone of the Democratic Party and helping put so-and-so into office and whatnot. This sort of language concerns me, because then the stereotype becomes, well, if you're a Black woman, or if you're a person of color, or if you're LGBTQ or whatever, then you support the establishment. It's your face who's that of the enemy. And we already have enough to deal with, right? Like, we already have to deal with enough racism, sexism, you name it. And so the last thing I need is to also then be the enemy for the left. If I don't know if I'm making sense, it's like, it's an unfair portrayal because it's not accurate. But it also is one that I think repeatedly, like obscures, if not intentionally degrades and overlooks the contributions, and if not like literal creation in some ways, of left ideology by people of color, by women, by marginalized groups who've had to fight using the language of oppression as a means of political organization, And I think that like the fact that we're being forced into these like positions, political positions, like the sort of blanketing of our groups is really dangerous, because it puts us, it creates like a hyper visibility on us for reasons that I'm not comfortable with at all.
Yeah, I can understand that. And I think there's at one point Biden even kind of made a comment to the effect of limiting the kind of Black community to one monolithic entity. And I think that the concept of that you're describing of the, I guess, zeroing in on certain establishment figures that also occupy marginalized identities becoming the enemy is also, I mean, it's something that I've noticed, and I feel like it's also very commonly like a avenue for people with other unresolved racist or racial kind of issues that it exposes them, or it acts as a venting mechanism or place for them, in that where they feel comfortable reaching into like racist memes or kind of racist tropes and so on and so forth to describe these marginalized people because they're representatives of an establishment figure, and then also painting with a broad brush, or then not recognizing the kind of uh, broader implications or broader effects of that language or of that kind of rhetoric being used generally and so forth. And I think, and the other point that you make about just these appointments in general and specifically to foreign policy, I think like the person in particular that comes to mind is Lloyd J. Austin the third. I guess this is a retired general who's currently on the board of Raytheon, who is actually currently under investigation from the DOJ, as corrupt as that already is, for financial problems. And so, like, the idea that somebody that sits on the board of directors for a defense industry company that's already under investigation is going to be brought into the Biden administration and essentially championed because of his identity, I think it encapsulates this kind of the obscuring of the the kind of horrific kind of underlying problems with the people in favor of identifying or of focusing in on their identity. And I think so. I think both of those points are important. Both the kind of, then does this person open up the opportunity for people to use, like, I see, for as a specific example, it's like the usage of like Uncle Tom's or other kind of epithets in that range being used by people that aren't black feels very uncomfortable for me. And Twitter has that anonymity to it, so that you never really know, and you can only more or less assume unless you're particularly familiar with a handle or whatever.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I think also like we see, for example, sometimes podcasters or like YouTube people or whatever calling people bitches, like men, cisgender men calling women or just people they don't like bitch. And I have the same discomfort that comes from that. Like that you're talking about with Uncle Tom and other like racist epithets that are sort of like intra community based, if that makes sense. Like it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's okay if like I use it or you use it, but like not something that I want like white comrades to be using necessarily. Although I think it is applicable in some cases, like regarding like because there may not be another word for it for other groups. So like I was asked once, would you call Ben Shapiro like an Uncle Tom for Jewish people? Because he was like aiding the right and the right wing that's like clearly anti-Semitic and things like that. And I was just like, whatever, like I don't personally take offense to it in that case because there may not be an applicable word, but it's a word or term that everyone understands the meaning of, right? It means you're a turncoat, someone who betrays your own group, etc. And perhaps we just need a different, like a better word for it, or better phrase that can be used for other groups as well. But it's definitely one that like people know what it means. The question is though, if you're using it to refer to Black people, if you're not Black, is it necessarily your place, and what that looks like? And it's a touchy subject. And as you said, I think it sort of gives people license, or people feel like it gives them license if they're criticizing someone's politics to then also dip into that kind of practice and not realize how it can alienate people of color who are also on the left. I mean, it's very similar to like, to me, it's the left version of like what we saw when Democrats were making fun of Trump and using his body or his mental capacity or his hair or whatever, like talking about his body or talking about certain aspects of who he is as a person, as opposed to like dealing with his politics, right? Because then you're going to say, oh, so there's something wrong with being fat. Okay, now you're just being offensive. You're like, you're sideways offending bigger people by virtue of talking about Trump's body, right? Or you're talking about supposed mental issues, like fill in the blank. I mean, there were so many that were used regarding Trump, but that then you're saying that there's some sort of inherent quality or correlation between having these mental issues and like his behavior or his politics, which there is not. Like, you don't have to be fat or mentally ill or whatever to like be a racist piece of garbage and a terrible president and like, you know, a Republican or whatever. Like, these things are not connected, because there are plenty of Republicans who are quote unquote respectful and smart and who went to Ivy League colleges and who, you know, are well dressed and in great shape, and it's not relevant, you know, like it's not connected, and you end up alienating people on your side too. And so I think that sometimes this also happens on the left. So I hear where you're coming from on that
I
front.
remember there was a lot of homophobia regarding like Trump and Putin too.
Yeah.
Like that was a big one.
Yes, I forgot about that. That's right. That was like one of the biggest ones, actually, like the most prevalent element. There was also a lot of like weird anti-immigration stuff because of Melania being an immigrant. So like, yeah, I recognize that he's a hypocrite, but like, you don't have to also like insult like women immigrants like because you don't like Melania. Like, there was a lot of just weird stuff going on. And so I'm glad that that's going to be gone, at least when he leaves office, among other things.
I was just gonna say it's just also in juxtaposition with what I think is kind of an overriding theme of kind of an appeal to trying to I don't know assuage white people in the center-ish to the right-ish and like appeal to this working class coalition without addressing race, and like that's predicated on more or less a don't offend this this kind of this mysterious white working class grouping that
Mm-hmm.
is supposedly aligned with us on a long class interest, but is not ready for wokeness or,
Right.
you know, like ID poll or in the derivative. Like they're not willing to. It's this weird juxtaposition of where we're supposed to continue a long 200-year plus history of just, you know, accepting the consistent and constant, you know, racism and sexism and so on and so forth from well-meaning white leftists that just haven't learned the language, so on and so forth. And it's like we're supposed to continue doing that, but then also we can't offend these well-meaning white leftists and their uncles and brothers and fathers and whatever that can't deal with not being able to say these racial slurs and not being able to do those things. It's like, so it's just like it's a frustrating thing where there's a suggestion that, well, if the most marginalized peoples of the working class coalition just put aside their non-specific, you know, generalizable working class conditions that appeal to white leftists and their family, that then we can reach this thing. And it's just like we've done that for hundreds of years. You know,
Right,
that's
right.
the general appealing to this, and what we've gotten is further centrism. We've gotten Joe Biden and we've gotten Donald Trump, and Donald Trump still being like the favorite candidate for Republicans in 2024. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, it's where you kind of see, and again, like you and I, and me separately, you separately, like we've had this discussion ad nauseum, right? Like we discussed it on Delete Your Account. I discussed it nonstop on Twitter, and have for literal years. Like I'm exhausted, to be honest. Like I had a moment the other day where I said to myself, you know, like I'm just gonna stop trying to convince people that racism is also bad. Like, you know, it's like a bottom barrel, like, should be a given. You know, I shouldn't have to explain that to people anymore. I shouldn't have to explain why like racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-immigration sentiment, like xenophobia, all these things are also bad, and they limit our reach as leftists to bring more people into our coalition. And if you are okay with those things, what you're telling me is you're okay having a coalition that's basically limited to white straight men who are Christian. Like, that's what you're telling me. And I don't think that that's where we need to go if we're trying to expand a base. And people, I've said it, I mean, I wrote an article about this back in 2017, 2016 or whatever, where I said, you know, if people keep doing this, they're going to sit and wonder, like, why there are so many people of color who are still voting for Democrats that are real shitty, but that they see as their only option. And like, if you have like a stench following you, you know what I mean? The stench in this case being that you're racist, you're sexist, whatever else, you either need to take a bath, clean up your shit, or you need to just embrace it. I don't know. I mean, like, people are just embracing it, I think, instead of trying to rectify what's going on internally on the left that needs to be fixed. And it's like a long-term problem. Like, I've talked about this as it relates to books that have been written about this. So like Michael Dawson's book, Blacks In and Out of the Left. I discussed that on one of the Jacobin podcasts, and the podcast is not itself the Jacobin podcast, but it's affiliated with Jacobin. And like, you know, it's important that we recognize that, like, if we're going to build a coalition, we don't all need to be, you know, anti-racist educators. Okay. Like, that's not necessary. We don't have to necessarily use that kind of language, but what we do need to recognize is, like, racism shouldn't have a place on the left as a premier, you know, like, aspect of our politics. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that you can't have someone in your coalition who's racist. Like, maybe not a Nazi, right? Like, don't be racist to that degree, but like, you may have expressed some opinions or continue to express some opinions that are, like, quote unquote off color or not PC. And what you do in those moments with someone like that is you take them aside and you say, look, man or woman or whomever, like, we have people in our group that are just like you, that are struggling just like you, and we have to respect one another and fight together. And in order for us to best do that, we can't be like calling people out of their names and, like, you know, insulting people based on who they are and these like fundamental aspects of their identity. Like, they're just like you in that they are also being oppressed by the state. They're also being left out in the cold economically and being ignored. And we need to come together on that front. And in order for us to come together, we have to also see each other as equals, you know? And like, this is something you and I have talked about this. You've definitely talked about this a ton as it relates to Fred Hampton. Hampton had those things, those sorts of elements to his politics as primary, you know, like, before you join coalition with me, before you form a group with me, before you like come into my home, you need to clean your feet off. You know, like, you have to understand that we are your equals. And he had, like, within the, you know, the primary objectives of the Rainbow Coalition, there were aspects that were like, you have to adhere to anti-racist principles before you come on with us. And that's important. I think that's an element of his politics that lots of people like to ignore. They say that he brought all these people together, but they ignore the part of like how that happened and why that happened. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that, like, in order for us to operate as a unit, as a strong unit, we can't keep alienating people on the basis of this bullshit just because we want to appeal, or some people want to appeal to it. Yes, an imagined white working class, because when I say that, like, I've said over and over that it's not the white working class that are explicitly racist. It's these people who are purporting to speak for them that are racist. And it's actually their racism, their personal racism that they can't get over, or their family's personal racism that they can't get over. And they're trying to project it onto other white people. When, like, I don't see poor white people as my enemy. The majority of poor white, not saying that they're all perfect, of course, but the poor white people that I know are not worried about me being black or not, or a woman or not. They're trying to eat. They're trying to survive too. And like, that's what we need to be focusing on, instead of people assuming that all poor white people are racist or something, or that's what you have to lead with in order to get them to come onto a coalition with black people, when in actuality, half of them are already working alongside black people and other people of color. And in some cases, you know, are seeing them as competition because of the rhetoric that's been put out by the Republicans and the Democrats in large degree. And what we need to be doing, instead of like regurgitating those same bullshit talking points against other groups of color, we need to be trying to correct that, and not correcting it by like chastising people necessarily, but trying to reframe the messaging. And I think that's really easy to do. And people are just like, some people are not brave enough to do it because of their own personal biases and their own biases in their family. And they don't want to get over that. But I want to switch gears really quick, but you can obviously feel free to weigh in on that. But I know you wanted to talk about the Indian protests, and I would love to hear more about that. I've been kind of reading here and there and seeing some footage of it on like Democracy Now! And other places, but I haven't been closely following it. So I'd be curious to know your thoughts. But yeah, feel free to add whatever you want, and then we can talk about that.
Well, I think one of the central things that ties all this together is the kind of the anti-capitalism, and what I think part of what isn't being recognized, I think, in some corners is just that race, like maintaining those racist beliefs is not good anti-capitalism, and is like that's like what was very central to Hampton's coalition as well, was that we're not going to beat capitalism with black capitalism or any form of that, but with anti-capitalism, with communism, socialism. That's so you're not executing that if you're maintaining these kind of racist tendencies. And I think that also aligns with the international solidarity, and India plays a role in that as well. And so like what we're seeing there is basically there was a government subsidy, or essentially a government floor of prices that farmers were able to sell their goods for, and essentially neoliberal reforms are trying to take that away and replace it with some rhetoric that the farmers have explicitly said does not make them feel as though that they're going to be protected in the way that they are. And it's resulted in massive, and when I say masses, I'm talking about tens, hundreds of millions of people striking. And you're not really seeing much about it, like you did see like the Hong Kong protests, or like pro Guaido protests, or we heard about what the Bolivian election, even to a degree. It's, I think, in large part because there's a lot of iconography with hammer and sickles, and it's a lot of communists that are acting, and just that aspect of it is very uncomfortable for Western media to cover.
Nice.
Yeah, and so it's also, there's other reforms in there, but essentially Indian farmers live off of about $650 US dollars a year. And so the floor that they're concerned about is very important. And so even marginally chipping away at that can have not just drastic effects for the individuals, but can have drastic effects systemically for India's agriculture, which basically would lead it towards more commercial agriculture like we've seen in the United States. And India doesn't necessarily have a pathway for these citizens to move out of agriculture and into some other industry that would then, like they're not considering these things. And it's largely predicated on the desperation of capitalism model, where the more desperate they make people, the more creative they get to find ways to, sustain themselves. And then that capitalism succeeds more or less in that kind of general model. And I guess I'll pass it to you there.
So do you know anything about like the process of getting these farmers together, like what the origin of all of this is?
I know that the Communist Party is in India, and like there's various regional parties throughout India, because India is obviously a massive country, both geographically and numerically with the people, and so there's a variety of parties that are involved. But as far as I know a lot of it's being headed up by a lot of communist parties. But then a lot of the farmers kind of organically just, I think a lot of this emerged organically at the markets, and like through just speaking to one another and kind of recognition of what was happening. But I will look further into that. Well, you go on.
No, sure. I mean, I was just curious because, one of the challenges here is just like the extensive surveillance that we have in the United States. And obviously, like organizing online is pretty much a no-go, but that's what a lot of people are doing right now because of the pandemic, right? I'm just curious, like, not necessarily what something like this would look like in the United States, because I don't see it happening in the United States. Not to be pessimistic, but like we don't have a farming economy or an agricultural economy anymore in the same way that we used to, because of outsourcing and all these things. And I think the way that a mass scale protest would look in the United States would be slightly different just by virtue of the nature of the economy and work here, right? Like the way labor operates in the United States, the majority of people, what kind of work they're doing, like the grand majority of our working class is in the service sector. So like fast food jobs, grocery store workers, drivers, and a lot of like third party style gig work. So I wonder somewhat, like, I just feel like we're so we have like a sprawling breakdown of our, like the way labor is sort of separated per, I don't know if I'm making sense, but like, you know what I mean? It's almost like a spider of sorts, right? As opposed to, like one small thing, or like, I don't know. I'm not making sense. I'm not making
Yeah,
sense. I'm trying to make sense. I'm just like really tired. But I think that
no,
what my point is, like, there's so many different sectors here, and of them, it's not a lot of manual labor. It's like so much gig economy style labor, service sector labor, and then how do you? The question is like, what would organizing those groups look like here? And it would be different, I think, than perhaps, because what we're looking at in India reminds me actually of like Russia in 1917. You know what I'm saying? That when you think about like farm labor and whatnot, you think about like the origin of communist revolutions, as opposed to the kind of revolution we might have here, which I think would have a slightly different set of characteristics.
yeah, just looking further into it, it looks as though a lot of it came from the farmers, like themselves, like I was saying, basically speaking of the marketplace, and then the trade unions as well, which is another place that has been devastated in the United States
Yeah.
since its heydays. And it's been, I think, when you speak to organizing, that's a critical aspect of it, and not just organizing uh, for a particular cause or something like that. But I think what's key about unions and that specific style of organizing is the capturing of power.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of the next step that I think people are looking for. I think some people have started to organize things to meet material needs in their communities, and I think that was critical and extremely critical in COVID, because the government simply was not doing it.
Right.
People gave people a $1,200 check and said good luck. You know,
Yeah.
and so people, like I've seen just people set up, like a bookshelf in their front yard with food that just gets dropped off and picked up, and it's not specifically heavily organized or anything, but it's given people something to organize around, and seeing things happen in local parks. And I've seen uh, things like hair cuttings in the park, and doing things that are maybe not exactly specifically in the realm of legal, but amid the conditions right now isn't necessarily something that's attracting police attention, given the plethora of concerns that are out there, and the
Yeah.
lack of resources that are available. Many states and localities are extremely strapped for resources as a result of shortened tax income because of, again, COVID, and then also because the federal government has failed to pass legislation to meet those shortfalls in the budgets, and a cover for increased state unemployment benefits that have been haphazard, or that has been haggardly passed out, and not effectively. Many websites crash, people have been unable to get access to them, and so
Right.
we have these kinds of events transpiring. And I guess with India, you have it's not as if India is as developed economically or technologically as much of the United States is, but the more you realize, the more you look internationally, the more you realize in the, like, the the mecca, or the like top, uh, the highest economic producing parts of various countries around the world, much of the United States is actually far behind what's going
Oh
on
yeah,
there.
for sure.
While the economic disparities still in the United States are among the highest, if not the highest, comparatively around the world. Other countries have managed to take that concentration of wealth, and while still having billionaires and absorbent wealth concentrated among a few hands, still manage to socially distribute things, because they recognize at the bare minimum that there's certain things that you provide society that make them more productive, even if your only intention is to exploit them for your own personal gain.
Mm. A lot of thoughts about what you just said. So thank you for saying it that way, because I think that helps like clarify what I was trying to say. So it's not so much a matter of like, oh, we're more developed or whatever. It's almost like in that more technical development, what we've seen is like a further alienation from labor, right? And a dangerous one. And I think that one that like makes organizing here more difficult in some ways, not always, but like in some ways, because everyone's like off doing their own thing, right? And I mentioned in passing on Twitter once, I was just like, so many people are unemployed right now that what does union organizing look like? Like, how do we deal with that aspect of things as well? Like, not just the fact that, like I already mentioned, labor has such a like different set of characteristics in hyper capitalist countries, but also the fact that, like, if people are unemployed as they are now and en masse, what do we do in terms of labor, or like, what does labor organizing look like for the not only the unemployed but the undocumented too, right? Like, that's another element in the US that we have like a massive issue with, in terms of like not having labor unions or any sort of representation for undocumented workers who make up a massive percentage of our labor force here. It's like just completely under the table, and have very little representation. There are some groups that try to advocate on their behalf, but in terms of their personal rights to organize, they're few and far between. And obviously, because of the fact that they're like under constant threat of deportation or being caught as being here, quote unquote, illegally or whatever. The other thing you mentioned about sort of people doing their own thing, I don't know. I feel like, I have to think back to like when Trump was first elected and people were freaking out. Some people, not everybody, but like some people, especially liberals, were freaking out. And, I'm going to move to Canada. And there was all this sort of hyperventilating about what's going to happen with Trump in office. And I remember at the time just tweeting and commenting to friends, like, at this point, we're going to have to combine our resources and think about every single thing like each person is individually capable of in order to help people off the record, right? Like under the table. What can be done? Are you a healthcare professional? Are you someone who has access to medication through some other means? Are you someone who has some sort of skill, legal or otherwise, to help people out for free, pro bono work, And I also, at the time, like back when you could still travel safely, I was going to Brazil a lot and other countries and Turkey, Europe, parts of Europe. And I would be able to get some medicines that were here you require a prescription for, but I could get them over the counter or, like just going up to the pharmacist and asking rather cheaply. And I would keep them and give them to people. Like I wasn't selling medicine. I was literally sending people like life-saving, in some cases, medication, because it was free or available without a prescription in other countries. And like, those are the sorts of things that at the time, we didn't have COVID to worry about, but at the time was a helpful way of thinking about like what we can do beyond the formal organizing that takes place. But nowadays, I think it's obviously complicated by travel limitations and health, just because there's a pandemic. But those are things that people have to start doing. I mean, I think that's perhaps one alternative for the time being, to the lack of unions in the United States, the lack of union-based infrastructure, particularly for unemployed and undocumented people. This idea of mutual aid that I'm happy is becoming, it's coming to the forefront for a lot of organizers as a way to meet people's needs. But obviously it has to go beyond that, because you can only do so much as an individual. You can only do so much as one organization or a few organizations, whether they're formal or not. And we just don't, we don't necessarily have a way of turning those mutual aid efforts into like a nationwide infrastructure, because of the limits that are placed on that, and also because of the way like so many of these movements get so quickly co-opted. Like I saw there was I'll shut up in just a second, I promise. But there was a Haymarket Books discussion, which I'll find and link in the description for this podcast, or in the show notes. But they were talking about the fact that Black Lives Matter isn't just, or like the movement for Black Lives isn't just one organization. It's like a myriad organizations with doing all sorts of different things, tackling issues that affect Black people, and particularly poor Black people, from a variety of different angles. And yet the way they're presented in the press or the mainstream media, or just even on the left, is sort of like one big monolithic like unit. When in actuality it has a lot of sort of anarchic qualities. It's horizontal leadership and things like that end up lending it the ability to kind of function on multiple levels in ways that sometimes if you're just one organization, you have limitations placed on you, in that regard, because you have to deal with negotiating with government for contracts and funding and all of this stuff. And it's very limiting, and you don't necessarily have the ability to reach as broad of a community. At the same time, the limitation is, of course, that there's not often a clear single message. There's not a point person. There's not, like a lot of things are blamed on Movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter that happen because they don't have a single spokesperson to go to and say, oh no, we didn't advocate for that or whatever. But I do think that through this type of organizing, despite some of its flaws, there is more opportunity to reach a greater number of people, a broader group of people, and perhaps do more work than they would be able to do if they were just like a single organization with a single message and a single spokesperson or board or whatever.
No, I think that's all excellent points, and I'm reminded of a few things. One of the things I think of is I imagine DeRay is probably still like being presented in various boardrooms or whatever corporate meetings and stuff as basically the BLM, and like we've had him and now he's spoken to us, and so now you've done your thing, you can put a hashtag on your Instagram and you've done the thing, you're good to go back to Wall Street and exploiting people. And one of the other aspects that kind of comes to my mind is it reflects to me back in the early days of BLM and the just movement for Black Lives in general, and the reactions to Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, and beyond, and the many Tamir Rice, and the list that's far too long, Laquan McDonald, and so continues. And the kind of disruptive nature of some of the protests early on, and the kind of backlash to, my traffic is being interrupted. And I'm thinking to the kind of class solidarity aspect of what organizing looks like now, and the union aspect, and Amazon, and we're approaching a holiday. And I wonder, if Amazon workers said, you know what, we've been working through COVID without adequate protections, we're not getting adequate testing in the facilities, they're not getting shut down when there's testing or when people are discovered and people aren't being sent home appropriately, our wages are poor, we're being pushed to the point where, there's all sorts of stories about, people having to relieve themselves in like bottles and so that they can meet quotas and so on and so forth. It's just deplorable working conditions, so on and so forth. Say Amazon employees managed to, through Reddit or some other, platform where they've been, communicating with each other, they shut down and people's Christmas presents don't arrive. Are they going to be more upset about their Christmas presents being not arriving, or are they going to be more upset about the horrific conditions that caused all these workers to act in solidarity and refuse to work under those conditions at this point in time?
Right. We know what they're going to be more upset about, sadly.
Right. And so I don't think that there's like people like, the part of the argument that we were talking about earlier is that people say that, that if we focus on the class solidarity without addressing the racism, that somehow that will avoid the kind of conflicts and the pushbacks and all that stuff. And it's like, that's not the case. Like, people aren't going to be any more excited about disrupting their lives for workers than they are about, than they were for all the early Black Lives Matter protests. And we had a kind of a peak moment after the murder of George Floyd, and so many people in the country were forced to watch it. And, and sometimes, many of us too many times, and times and conditions when it just simply wasn't appropriate, and it became a meme, and it became a whole lot of other things. And I even saw it after the whatever Paul brother fight or whatever. And so like it's been a critical moment in this, and one of the things that we had hoped that we were going to get is what we did see after some immediate radical protesting and action, that there was at least promises of significant changes. How much of those materialized after the radical protesting faded away, or at least to the degree that it was at. And there are still people in the streets in Kentucky for Breonna Taylor, and beyond and across the country still. Like, I mean, there's Manuel Ellis in Tacoma and several more, and there's another shooting not too like within a week or so of when we're recording. I don't have the name off the top of my head. Again, there's just so many people that are getting murdered in the streets that it becomes difficult and trying just to keep them all in your head, because while they're in your head, you keep their stories too, and those stories are so devastating. And so, I mean, it becomes a burden that I carry as much as I can, but I admit I falter in some cases when it comes to remembering all of the names of all of the deceased and all that have been murdered by police and that continue. And most recently, we've heard Joe Biden to the front of where we're heading electorally or politically, basically regurgitate the bad apple routine. And it feels very much that we're taking even a step back from the beer summit even.
Oh yeah, it definitely. I mean, I think we are regressing in a lot of ways on this front. I'm sure you saw already the leaked discussion. There was a conference call with Joe Biden and several, people just defined as Black leaders, people who are over, the NAACP and other Black groups. Not any that we would consider, radical in any way, but like kind of, centrist or establishment aligned leaders. And they were so passive and sort of deferential to Biden, and Biden was insulting the whole way through, racist the whole way through, engaged in practices of pitting Black, I should say African American and Latino people against one another at one point. I mean, it was just a hot mess, and and literally he kept going back to this whole defund the police thing is why we're in this mess. And as Democrats losing the House and whatnot, or potentially losing the House, or losing seats, I should say, in the House, not losing the House, but losing House seats and whatnot. It's just, I don't know. There's a lot of deep sighing in this podcast, this episode, because that's my constant state of being at this point. But I think, first of all, what's interesting to me is when I see some people on the supposed left start regurgitating these same lines from the Democrats. And it's really disturbing, actually, because sometimes they preempt the Democrats. So before the Democrats start saying things like defund the police is not the best slogan, or defund the police is what made us lose seats, I remember hearing some leftists say it, or people who call themselves leftists. They were like, abolish the police is not a good slogan. Okay, what about defund the police? Well, defund the police is not a good slogan because it's too much of a threat, and people aren't going to like it, and white suburban voters aren't going to like it. But I'm like, do I give a shit what white suburban voters think? Maybe on some things, but for the most part, they're not the ones who are putting progressives in office. They're the ones who are voting for Biden top of the ticket and Republicans all the way down. I'm not worried about what white conservatives in the suburbs think personally. That's not my focus. That's not my base. What I care about is like, who is benefiting the groups on the bottom, who's supporting them, who's standing up for them, who's putting in legislation, if anything, that's going to help these people survive, at least, instead of making their life worse. And, white suburban voters are not necessarily the ones with those concerns at top of mind. And so they're going to be fine no matter what. I worry about the people who are not going to be fine under either administration. And so it's really frustrating to see sometimes this language being spouted by people who are supposed to be our allies, comrades, whatever. But then I also see a similar kind of, breakdown, or I saw a breakdown when it came to Black Lives Matter, because instead of going out, some people, not all, but instead of going out to some of these protests and working with people on the ground and trying to radicalize people further beyond just thinking about race and policing, but also thinking about the way race and class, class inequality and access to healthcare and all these things combined results in the kind of violence that we see police, carry out in certain neighborhoods against certain groups of people. There's a lot of stuff happening at once that leftist activists, people who identify as leftists could have gone into these protests and actually gotten people to talk about, because I think some people don't understand necessarily the link between anti-capitalism and anti-racism, and it exists, and it's a strong one. And I think that there could have been a moment, that would have been a moment to capitalize on that. I hate to use that word, but being like anti-capitalist, to capitalize on it and kind of use it as an outlet to discuss all of these interconnected issues, and make these kinds of progressive movements towards racial equality even more progressive, and say, look, it's not just race here. Like, these people are being targeted and harassed and killed, yes, on the basis of their skin color and on the basis of the racist history of this country, but that kind of behavior is further fueled, replicated, and intensified by virtue of economic issues and inequality and even like imperialism, right? Because they're testing this weaponry on people who are just like us abroad and bringing it back here onto our streets. So like, we need to protest from like a variety of angles and make demands from a variety of angles. And that opportunity was missed in many ways by some leftists who don't want to see race as a quote unquote real issue that the left needs to tackle, or racism, I should say, not race, but racism. And arguably, they let the ball drop. They let an opportunity pass while they were so busy talking about how Black Lives Matter is neoliberal and this and that, when they didn't really know anyone who worked with Black Lives Matter. They didn't know people who were working on the ground. They didn't listen to the people who were doing podcast after podcast who were saying, look, I'm a Marxist and I'm in the streets for Black Lives Matter. Those kinds of people got ignored, and they instead focused on what was a capitalist rendering of the Black and like co-opting of the Black Lives Matter stuff in the streets. That's who they listen to. And this is also what happens with identity politics, which we've talked about before. But like, instead of looking at what's actually happening, they're looking at the capitalist co-optation thereof and criticizing that, and then applying that to the entire movement when that's not the movement's fault, right? Like, just like you wouldn't necessarily say Jacobin is bad or communists are bad or socialism is bad because some progressive representative or senator or whatever got co-opted by the right. You wouldn't blame the whole movement. You would blame that individual. But when it comes to Black issues, this is what I was talking about earlier, right? When it comes to Black issues in particular, and a lot of issues related to people of color, like you see this with the immigration movement as well, the blame is not placed on capitalism for co-opting a movement and turning it into like a trend. The blame is placed on individual people of color who are fighting for their rights every day, and they're the ones who are portrayed as the enemy by some of these people. And what I just feel like that's so incredibly craven and like messed up and like just myopic, like you're and intentionally so, because the other option is to look at the opportunity that some sort of movement like this offers to radicalize people as a vector, as an entry point. And instead what they're doing is they're throwing their hands up and they're saying, well, it's co-opted. No point in discussing it anymore. No point in addressing this. Let's give up. It's much easier to do that, and it's a problem.
Yeah, it's because then don't have to unpack your own stuff or the stuff around you that you've, been a party to or seeing or whatever. And I mean, I can understand to a degree, I'm not a member of every marginalized group. And so I can understand at least somewhat to a degree, like why it's tempting or easy to like reach for misogynistic tendencies or tropes or learned behavior when criticizing somebody like Joanne Reed or something, because I like a lot of about what she does upsets me, and it's frustrating, and it's counterproductive in a lot of ways, I believe. But like, I also recognize that she makes an easier target for me because and I can also be caught not addressing, like I mentioned, all those things, learned behavior and so forth, misogynistic tendencies, because, I can lean on her bad politics, and it leaves room, and it grant more space for it, and so on and so forth. But to me, that's a lot of what it is just not wanting to unpack those things, not wanting to dig into, like, why do I not really want to deal with how racism is intricate in unpacking anti-capitalism and engaging in anti-capitalism, and how anti-racism can't be separated from that. And it's a lot easier to just be like, oh, well, I just want to focus on this other part and not have to learn about why these other white leftists that I revere were inadequate in these areas, or why their philosophies or their recommendations didn't apply, couldn't be transposed specifically to the U.S. conditions for Black Americans or other marginalized communities within the United States. And it becomes very difficult. And what you mentioned about like the defund the police thing, I wanted to mention is like, police are murdering Black people in their homes with impunity, and then they're coming in between Black Lives protesters and white supremacists and putting their back towards the white supremacists and putting their shields towards the people protesting for Black lives. It's like defunding those people is a remarkable compromise in and of itself.
That's
Like
right.
abolishing is a polite way to deal with it, I believe. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
look at what we're dealing with, a gang, like with a group of people that are just uh like just killing people. They're killing and abusing and robbing people. The recently study came out that police were stealing more property than burglars were.
Jesus.
And yeah, this is the perpetual nature, the whole institution of policing is rotten to the very core. Every aspect of it is not, I can't even say corrupted, because it was instituted and created in such a nefarious way and for such nefarious purposes in every aspect, from in the southern with the slave patrols, and in the north as specifically anti-union, anti-worker crackdowns. That was essentially where the formalized policing came from in the north. So like, as well as helping return slaves to the south, but primarily it was used by merchants to secure cargo and secure property, and to basically beat the crap out of workers who demanded too much. And so like that was where the police came from. And so it's not fair to say that they're corrupted or that they need to be reformed or anything. The very institution at its core is devious, is nefarious, and should not be salvaged. And the ideas that are worth keeping of, uh, like getting people, rehabilitating people so that they can be members of society in ways that we can all get along, and so on and so forth. Like those are separate. We can separate that from the policing institution and the criminal justice system as it exists. And so when people say abolish the police or defund the police, or abolishing the criminal justice system or prisons and so on and so forth, not only do they mean it, I mean, they mean it and more most of the time, although there has been the most recent liberal co-option, at least with the defund of, which is really kind of maybe defund some of them, defund some social programs, but we really want to keep the police, because who else are we going to call when the poor people come for our stuff? And it's just like, and so like, I what people, they mean it when they say defund and abolish the police, and that's okay, and that's what we should want, because look at what they are doing. Like, look
Right.
at the role that they are performing in society, and it's not, addressing crime. They spend less than 5% of their time dealing with violent criminals. The vast majority of their time is done, or is dealing with paperwork, speeding violations, ticketable offenses, that type of stuff. The interfering in domestic violences, stopping bank robberies, all that kind of stuff is only about 5% of police time. Most of the investigation work is done by detectives, which are separate from police, and in most of those domestic violence cases, they arrive on scene afterwards. And in several states, they have basically laws where all they can do is show up and either take both people to jail or nobody to jail and then leave. And so there's countless stories of their inadequacies of dealing with rape, and piles and piles of untested rape kits, and even shaming rape victims, or
Mm-hmm.
raping the people themselves. So
Yeah.
like, and domestic violence, they're more likely to commit domestic. So like, there's so many reasons that people should want to abolish the police. They, like, it shouldn't even be a point of contention on the left, in my opinion. Sorry.
No, no, you're right. I mean, like defunding is the least we could do. Like this is like the minor side. This is what's interesting to me, right? I was just thinking about this when you said it, but so the other day, Vivek Chibber did an interview, and he said, he's an academic on the left. He's often accused of being a class reductionist, and he's the editor right now of Catalyst magazine, which is like an offshoot of Jacobin. And he was doing an interview on the new like Jacobin YouTube channel and podcast, and he was saying, that instead of defund the police, we should be saying things like build more schools, not jails, or whatever. Which, like, okay, fine, but like, why not both? Like, can't we have both things? It seems to me that it's a very like liberal. So for all the left hand wringing about liberals and people that they call woke scolds and whatnot, not policing people's language, it's ironic and funny to me that the people who accuse others of doing that are doing that, right? And they're doing it it ends up resulting in the undermining of a process of activists. You know what I'm saying? Like they're in the process or they were in the process of trying to push this movement to change the way we understand policing, if not to get rid of it altogether. And it's strange to me to see people who are self-identified leftists talking about how they're afraid to alienate people with language. You know what I mean? Like this seems like to me a liberal preoccupation, right? Like if we're supposedly, if we're talking about snowflakes and all of that, right, to use some right-wing language here, if we're worried about that, well, it doesn't seem like it has any place on the left. Like last time I checked, our focus should be like the end result of these movements and not necessarily like having the perfect language in the perfect moment to appeal to people who aren't going to necessarily give a shit anyway. Like the people that we need to be reaching are like, I mean, yes, I guess as I said before, we do need to reach white, upper middle class people who live in the suburbs at one point for certain things, but like they shouldn't be our primary focus. And I find it, as I said, I find it odd that people who complain all day long about the policing of language are worried when we use certain language about police. You know what I mean? Like it just seems it's an interesting place to be coming from. That's all I say. And it's odd to me that this is boiling down to semantics as opposed to the meaning and purpose behind it. Because at the end of the day, if you're a socialist, you want that funding. That's the millions of dollars that's going to police to buy weapons to kill poor people. You want that money to be going instead towards resources to help poor people, to sustain people's lives, and to make everyone's lives and quality of life better. It's odd to me that we're going to be sitting around twiddling our fingers and talking about language instead of getting in the streets and demanding to not only defund the police, but do a whole lot more. That's what we should be doing. We should say, you know what? Like, and I saw this in the discussion of, or I see this present in the discussion of Occupy Wall Street as well. Like there's all this discussion about what Occupy Wall Street did wrong and what Black Lives Matter did wrong, as opposed to thinking perhaps about like what we can take from those movements and do better and make stronger and really push to result in material change that's necessary for our survival and like everybody's survival, not just yours and mine, but like everybody's survival. Because the more money we spend on policing, less money we have for other things. The more money that goes to the top 1%, the more money that's taken, I should say, by Wall Street, those sorts of things, it matters. And people are like freaking like dissecting language as opposed to thinking about the ways that they can like materially help these movements. It's mind-boggling to me. Like I don't get it. I don't know. Maybe I'm slow or something and stupid, but I personally don't understand the sole preoccupation for some people with language or what some group is doing wrong, as opposed to thinking about ways to make them stronger and better. And I mean, I guess one could argue that like what he's doing is offering constructive criticism, but to have like a whole episode about like why defund the police is not the right language just seems like really top down elitist, like an elitist preoccupation to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, part of the frustration is the engagement from people that think this is something that was, just thought about, a few years ago or something. It's like the abolition movement is long and has deep roots that go way back. And like the abolition of prisons is more specifically more largely written about specifically rather than abolishing the police, but that was kind of a natural conclusion of the concept of abolishing the prison industrial complex as it exists. And I think the idea of the sloganeering a lot of that comes from people that are just now engaging with abolition and critiquing it from a perspective of, oh, if you want more people to get along on board with this are the words you got to use. And it's like, okay, well, it's one, like you mentioned, it's very important to just understand at the critical root is we want to completely change the way that we do criminal justice. And so if you're getting people signed on for just, putting cameras on cops so we have good footage of them killing people, that's not what the abolition movement is after. And that is just a co-option of their language and their efforts in order to perpetuate neoliberalistic solutions to the policing and modest reforms that don't actually make the fundamental changes that people are after. And so the identification of those people being opposing groups, I think, is accurate. And I think that comes as an affront to a lot of liberal-minded people that they have a very paternalistic attitude towards the abolition movement, and that they think that they want what's best for them, and that means using these words and striving after these goals. But then not only do they essentially just push the movement right, and this is often people that are from the more of a class reductionist far left sphere or whatever, but they not only do they push the rhetoric right, they also undermine the progress that's being made by the radical activist movements that are enthused by this messaging and this notion of radical changes to the point of abolishing the police. And rather than, like you mentioned, reinforcing it and emboldening it and empowering it with the avenues that they have, because when it comes down to it, we know that the abolitionists aren't going to have the microphones that the people that have the desires to temper the message are going to have. The message is going to be determined in the largest public spheres by the same people that are complaining about the abolish being too radical or defunding being too radical. So regardless of how it's framed among the radical activists, it's still going to be framed in mainstream corporate media by the types of figureheads and by the types of people that are going to use the more tepid languaging and the co-opting of language and all those types of things anyway. So the people that are going to be using the language that you think is going to be most appealing towards that group are going to be the liberals who I think Prison Culture said it really well recently. It was like, they're great at describing it, but their prescriptions are crap. That's paraphrased, by the way, but they can describe the suffering to a degree, but the prescriptions are always inadequate and then are always obstructed by Republicans, and that's always the excuse for why progress can't be made, and compromises must be made instead. And those compromises are always further whittling the social safety nets, further whittling the protections for workers, further whittling away the basic underpinnings of social coherence in the United States for the enrichment of a handful of people to, I would argue, a degree that they will allow the society that's holding them up to collapse underneath them. And whether they have plans for abandoning it or they're just throwing hazard to the wind and just assume that it'll sort itself out, I can't say specifically, but it seems as though that they're pushing people with the evictions, with the lack of care for or the money through COVID, with the lack of an economy to come back to once COVID's gone, and the gigification of everything, the Amazon actively working against people that are trying to unionize. Walmart's long had a history of doing that. These massive corporations conglomerating all of our media and entertainment so that, even the things that we use to escape from the droll parts of society are being controlled and dominated. Water has recently entered Wall Street speculation. And so we're approaching a very dystopian future, and it seems as though we're all just assuming things are going to get better. And I guess my concern and my prognostication is that it's going to be critical for the organization of individuals that have been meeting mutual aid needs to not look to these politicians for solutions, even the more hopeful ones like AOC or others of the squad, but to be expecting to form their own local power structures that meet the immediate needs and subscribe and do what is necessary in order to get there. Sorry.
No, don't apologize. I mean, you're absolutely right about all of that. And, not to be like the doom scroll podcast or anything, but I do agree that there has to be a deeper, more intense outside game being played, because once they're inside at the end of the day, with regard to politicians, like even if they personally hold progressive principles, they're forced in a lot of ways to do things to play the game, and it's sometimes a very long game, and it's a game that unfortunately allows a lot of us to get hurt in the process, right? While we're waiting, continuing to wait. And I think, we see a lot of people who are trying to be hopeful, who identify as progressive or leftist or whatever, who still engage in electoral politics. You see them trying to be hopeful and supportive of these politicians, but at the same time, like, sometimes it feels like a game or a process maybe that people should reconsider its security. Like how much of a gain are we making if we're just chastising these other politicians with like a tweet storm or in a speech, but then we don't have any material stuff to match that kind of anger. You know what I mean? We have to have actions and not just words. And sometimes I think we get caught up, attracted to, amused by the words, and we don't go deeper than that. And so that's why I agree that the outside part is also really important right now. And we need to be placing more pressure on politicians, regardless of I think just regardless of their ideological position too, because in a lot of ways we on the left often talk about pressuring Democrats because we don't expect Republicans to do anything for us. But Republicans, we can also pressure, especially if they're in districts where their seat is on the line, say, look, like, we won't vote you out of office if you at least do these few things and push these demands or whatever. There could be opportunities there, but I think we kind of we put a lot of our energies on Democrats. We focus a lot on pushing Democrats, and some of those Democrats aren't willing to budge, or they have other interests in mind that go way beyond the constituents, and we may not ever know what those are, be they personal or from lobbyists or some future cushy position being promised somewhere, like we see with Biden's full-on revolving door. Like, I have a lot of points that you pointed out that made me want to bring up things that I'd forgotten earlier, but like with regard to Biden's people, we went on and on and on in the press about Trump's cabinets and Trump's activities being super corrupt, and this revolving door this and his best friend that, and blah blah. And I'm looking at this current cabinet and I'm just like, how is this any different? Like the cabinet that Biden is putting together in terms of people doing favors. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. I used to work for this organization or this company, corporation, and now I'm going to do their bidding while I'm still in office with the government. Like, the separating line is gone on both for both parties. And so it's frustrating to me that like people can see it when Republicans do it, but not see it when Democrats do it. Some people, not all, but it's like very frustrating and kind of just reiterates reinforces the team aspect, of sports team aspect of politics in this country. If I don't like your team, I don't like what they're doing, but if my team does it, it's fine. That's a problem. But then going back to what you were talking about with regard to the abolition movements and things like that, I think one of the reasons that I cringe so much when I see leftists getting bogged down by semantics on this front is because it reminds me so very much, it's like a parallel of some leftist approach to international politics. And instead of focusing on how they can support, beleaguered or embattled, like left-leaning politicians in the global South, that are being torn down by right-wing coups or right-wing machinations and political machinations and whatnot. They start focusing on, well, he did this, or well, she did that, or well, it like becomes this like needling, like gadfly-ish approach that doesn't reflect necessarily what the leftists on the ground are doing. And it's very frustrating, and we see it aid the right over and over, right? And you mentioned that the sort of nitpicking on terminology like defund or abolish or whatever ends up aiding the right. And it does this process, it happens over and over and over and over. And you got to wonder, like, what's going to give? Are people going to prioritize change? Or are they going to prioritize being the guy in like the blazer with the, what is it, like the elbows? I think about like the old, like the stereotypical university professor with like his books in the background on the podcast and the blazer and you're just going to sound like an elite, and you're going to sound like someone who's not all that concerned about what happens to the people that you supposedly represent. You got to pick, and at the end of the day, I think that sometimes these people are very out of touch with reality, and then try, like we were talking about earlier, with people who think white working class people are all like members of the KKK or some shit. And it's not them. It's like the people who are saying that are the problem, not the people who are poor white people,
Well, it's been fascinating. Specifically, it just reminded me about with some of the Trump protests and kind of the far right wing generally, and the factions within that. Like, a lot of poor white people are very anti-police as well, like
Mm-hmm.
especially in rural communities. Like,
Mm-hmm.
they're not pro-police, and like so occasionally in some of these pro-Trump protests or conflict protests between Trump supporters and other various leftist groups, whether some of them for protesters for Black Lives, some of them just anti-Trump protesters, a variety of protesters, but uh, just the support for police and the bootlicking for police was not always like it raised tension sometimes among factions of the right. And so it's just like that opportunity is there, and it doesn't mean necessarily that you can't centralize the marginalized communities that are affected the worst by policing Black and indigenous people, especially in the many missing indigenous women, both in the United States and in Canada as well. And like, but you can also, doesn't mean that you can't also recognize that police shouldn't be murdering and abusing white people, even if it's slightly less frequently per capita than Black people. That's still problematic, and we should all still be really upset about that, not use it as an excuse for why it also happens to Black people more frequently. That's the wrong direction to be going.
Yeah, and I mean, Black Lives Matter recognizes this. You'll often see marches, or at least some expressing of support of people who are not Black, who are also antagonized by police. And the problem is that we are seeing a conflation, as per usual, and it's a convenient conflation because of who it lets off the hook, but a conflation between um, poor white people as a monolith and Trump voters as a monolith. And the reality is, as I've said over and over, and as statistics back me up on, the majority of Trump voters are not poor. The majority of his base is not poor. It's not poverty line poor. It's not broke white people. It's, sorry, my baby's screaming in the background. She agrees, I guess. But it's people who are still making middle to upper middle class, if not upper class salaries, who don't want to be taxed, who are also racist, who are also xenophobic, who are also fill in the blank, who vote for Trump. It's a culture war, if anything. It's not just economics. And I think that what gets lost is that people assume that if you don't have a college degree in this country, that you must be poor. But that's not the case. A lot of the people who support Trump are business owners, have money, have wealth, have houses, have cars, look at their trucks. Their trucks are, way more expensive than the tiny car we drive. Like, but I have a college degree and I'm getting a PhD, and I drive a car that's like, not in the best shape. It's small, it's whatever. And you'll see people who maybe didn't go to college, but who had a hookup through family or something, who own a small business or a bigger business, who knows, who drive a huge truck that's like the cost of my house. You know what I'm saying? So like, there's a disconnect. I think unfortunately, some people project onto education level a supposed class level. And that's not necessarily correlative. There are a lot of people like me who went to college, who went to get a master's degree, who are doing a PhD, who may have debt, who may have other forms of, like, may have academic debt. I don't have a ton of academic debt because I had full scholarships, but I do have debt from housing that I needed in undergrad, right? My mom couldn't afford to rent me an apartment in New York every year, like some of my peers. And it's just, it's a misunderstanding, and unfortunately a projecting onto certain people, because there's a conflation between culture and knowledge and class. And I have been in literal debates slash fights with people who have this idea. One of them, I always say, like, at this point I'm naming names because it doesn't matter. I don't have anything to lose by being frank about what has been said to me and what's already in the public record. But like Bhaskar Sankara, who's over the Jacobin magazine, he said to me directly pretty much that, like, just because he made the assumption that because I'm getting a PhD that I'm either wealthy or elite in some way, or like that I express or support elite interests, or that I am, and this is all a discussion slash a fight basically over the fact that I took issue with his dismissal of white supremacy being a problem in this country. And he basically said capitalism is the problem, not white supremacy. Like, people shouldn't be so worried about Nazis and whatnot. And I'm like, well, which people are you talking about? Because for some of us, we understand the direct connection between capitalism and white supremacy and are threatened by both and have to live life threatened by both. And so for me, I don't see, like, I guess my point is, like, I don't understand why some people assume that just because you have an education that you're also rich, because the majority of people, especially people of color who get educations, aren't rich. You may have a degree and that's all you got. You may not have a job to follow it. Whereas someone who has a high school education, if that, who's white, may have had greater access in a market and maybe making tons more than you do. I mean, I don't make any money right now. I'm on the job market looking for a job, but my funding is gone. I'm done with my funding. I'm at the end of my rope because I'm in the process of finishing my dissertation. So the money that I rely on is leftover grant money of when I was making $20,000, $25,000 a year. And I mean, that's not something that I could live on alone. I'm married and I have support from my husband that adds to that, but he's not rich either, So the point is, and I don't have family that can help me. I don't have people that can give me money. I'm not sitting on wealth of any sort, or like, I'm not sitting on like a trust fund or any of that, So it's frustrating that people don't understand that. And I think, especially on the left, there needs to be a very clear understanding that white supremacists and people like Trump are not exclusively supported by, not even overwhelmingly supported by, poor white people, And it's odd that people continue to regurgitate this, what was a liberal talking point. I remember when Trump won, MSNBC was saying this, going against all data that showed everything but that being the truth. And then I started to hear leftists say it, but then they were saying it in a way as if to, like, advocate for poor white people who voted for Trump. And I'm like, no, guys, like, the majority of poor people didn't vote for Trump regardless of race. So stop, I know the numbers this year are kind of distorted because of the going to the polls versus mail-in balloting, and how that was it made things a little bit more difficult to get data. So right now people are still trying to, like, digest and understand what went on this year demographically, like who supported Trump and why and where. But from the 2016 election, it definitely wasn't the case that he had more support from poor white people. A lot of poor white people stayed home. And so it's important to recognize, like, where you can build alliances, whom you think you're alienating and why. And it's not necessarily what people are presenting, because I think there's a misunderstanding of what the numbers say, and if not a distortion of what the numbers say to feed people's own narratives.
Absolutely, and there's long been issues with just the way we track income and wealth in this country, purposely obscuring both the disproportionate distribution, as well as the nuances that are there at the fringes and at the where they're at the fringes as well. And I think the narrative of the Trump supporters, that was even borne out as in errors in polling that they recognized and still didn't or appropriately correct for leading into 2020, but it was especially pronounced in 2016, where they, for a long time, basically polling, they had used education as a proxy for income, and then also for predicting the voting patterns. And it turned out that because there was a lot of low education voters that had higher incomes that voted Trump, it completely kind of threw a wrench in the expected outcomes and the modeling for a lot of the data and the polling. And so I think that it's such a well-established hegemonic kind of assumption that then it's people are still having a trouble disentangling that concept that actually no, Trump support comes from a suburban white women. He got a majority, I believe, in both 2016 and 2020. And so it's just like, that's not poor. Those aren't poor working class, in that traditional sense. I mean, many of them still working class, if not stay at home or whatever, but like they're not the rural trailer, or like farm, the supposed poor, where like there was that truck that was like broken down, but there was like new model vehicle, relatively new model vehicles. It was definitely newer than anything I drive. But like this image also of pouring down of middle class whites as well, that just happened to be rural. That was also a part of what was going on there as well.
Yeah, there's this weird assumption, definitely, that like rural means poor. And the irony is that this kind of language is also coming from leftists who claim to want to speak for the Midwest or like whatever, just like, guys, you don't know what you're talking. You live in New York too, like the people who are always like coastal elites, this and like of the left. I mean, the online leftists who say these things, and I'm like, you are also a coastal elite. Like usually the people saying these things are like pretty wealthy themselves, come from money, have massive degrees, have money, make money. You know what I mean? Like it's mind-boggling. I don't know. There's a lot of weird stuff going on that I'm not sure what to make of it, other than to say a lot of people are projecting and they also lack an understanding of what the South is, what the Midwest is, what poverty means, what working class means. I mean, there are a lot of missteps going on because of misunderstandings of these things, because they're based in a lack of knowledge, to be honest.
The working definition of working class or middle class has been so kind of just manhandled or whatever, just been completely stretched. And so very few people are operating with a kind of working understanding that working class is about a relationship to the productions or the means of production. Like that's not the kind of working class that a lot of people are working with. People envision working class as essentially synonymous for that vague middle class, that people that work jobs that they think are deserving of a living wage, and that aren't like too exploitative, like stockbrokers or something like that. So it encompasses a vague grouping rather than something specifically to deal with the relationship to the means of production.
I mean, it seems kind of like some people have taken working class to mean you work.
Yeah.
Like, don't work? Okay, then you're working class, right? And that's not necessarily the case. But I also feel like it's been like neatened up a little bit in there, because working class, in my mind, used to mean poor. It was like a euphemism for poor, right? And it was a euphemism used by politicians to clean up the language. And they didn't even use it very often, but when you did hear it, it was coming from those people to mean poor, because they didn't want to say poor or work. Like working poor is another, to me, euphemism for poor, because it sounds better than just saying poor, like, or
And never
poverty level.
I was sorry to interrupt. Just
No,
never
you're
the
fine.
undeserving people that aren't working,
Mm-hmm.
aren't trying. Continue, sorry.
Exactly. No, but that's exactly why. Middle class was the language used for the longest, and then I think we really saw an explosion with Bernie, and also, subsequent to the Occupy Wall Street movement. Well, you and I have talked about this before, how like the 99% can be a little bit misleading, in the sense that like my class position, albeit precarious at times and made even more so by this pandemic, is not the same as someone who literally only had that $1,200 check to survive on for the entire year, and that was it, right? We're both part of the 99%, but we're looking at very different realities. You know, like day-to-day life is going to be different for me versus someone who's in that position. And so I think we need to, on the one hand, I understand the function of that kind of language to increase the degrees of solidarity, but at the same time, you know, it would be to me, it has an almost like, it's like the class version of colorblind politics to me, colorblind race politics, in the sense that we're all one, we're all human beings, and we all should come together and support one another. So yes, okay, but also, like, because you are white or because you are non-black or because you are not indigenous, you're going to go through the world in a very different way than I will, right? And so that matters at times. It matters often, at like when we're talking about life experience and the way these systems impact us. And so when we're talking about wealth as well, I think sometimes the euphemistic language papers over these differences that, if we were to highlight, I think would make people more inclined to act, you know, like, I don't know. I mean, I understand the reason in terms of the kind of approach, how it can work both ways. Like, you can get more people on board if they also see themselves as working class, but it also operates to obscure differences that matter and that are dire and that we need to address first, you know, like, I don't know. Not to, again, I don't want to play the semantics game now either. Like, I don't want to do what I criticize other people are doing, but I do think that it's important that we recognize that, like, the term working class can mean a whole lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I don't remember why I brought this up. I guess because we were talking about, like, how people misinterpret education lining up with class, or rural lining up with class, when it doesn't necessarily apply always. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say on education, I think it's one of the things I bump up against a lot of is what education means. And I'm thinking Freudian sense of, you know, deeply engaging with the material world and coming up to a critical understanding of what it is and how to make it reflect the society and world that we want. And a lot of people, when they say education, they mean more of an indoctrination or a banking model of pouring specific information, be it either the kind of, you know, hegemonic U.S. imperialism or even more leftist or progressive ideas or whatever, and manipulating and tricking people into these things and pouring information. I don't think that that's what we need. What we need is, again, like a material and engagement with the world, and recognition that it's what it is, what we make of it. And I think that's also a critical part of unlearning a lot of the things that we have come to expect to just be how things are, or what it is, or whatever expression that people use to describe the situation, and that it is what we've made it, and that we can change it, and that we must change it, because, like, we have COVID, and we'd be remiss without mentioning climate generally, and also 2020 was the year that Australia burned. Like, half of, like, all of Australia was on fire for part of 2020, but that was like, because it started in 2019, and everything that's happened, it's easy to forget. And we mentioned also earlier the Indian farmers, and part of what they're going to be struggling with ongoing is the changes that climate change has brought into the Indian subcontinent, as well as it's dramatically changed life in Mongolia, and is having exacerbated and cataclysmic effects there. And it continues to be an issue. And the kind of middling reform and semantic wordplay, and the, you know, needling people along very slowly for lesser evilism and all this stuff, has to keep in mind that we have large challenges that we have to confront. And at some point, for me, it just becomes a recognition or a realization that there may be a point where the people that have the power are going to lead us into inevitable catastrophe, and the only opportunity or option, the only rational choice, is to take hold of that power as the people, as prescribed, both literally, constitutionally, and both, and then also in the kind of the spirit of uh, free people being governed by uh, with their consent. We have to take control of our destiny, and even if that means taking it away from the people that we've so long trusted.
So yeah, I think those are all points. I mean, I hate to make this like our end of the year wrap, but it kind of feels that like that, because we've addressed so many things that um, are ongoing problems, but then like problems that have come up that seem to be exacerbating not only um, on the political level, but also some issues that are recurring on the movement level. Like perhaps one of the things that we can leave people to think about is like how to better those things, or like how to ameliorate, some of the problems, how you yourself as an individual could be a part of either some mutual aid groups or donating time or money to organizations that are doing things, or people that are doing things. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if the political realm right now is necessarily the space that we can rely on. I actually know, in fact, that it is not. And so I agree that, beyond just assessing the disconnect between some members of the left, some online news people, some of the Democrats, all of that, I think we have to also think about, like, as individuals, where we can reconnect to people and help do things within our means. As much as we would like to be part of a collective, sometimes the collectives are doing things that we may not agree with, and like, what can you do to help in your own way? I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts?
I'm kind of reminded of the janitor with Paulo Freire, and that like the power of just being out in the community and meeting people where they are. You'd be surprised at how receptive people are of like just being heard and being understood, and not trying to convince them of anything, but just trying to relate and understand what are the needs and the concerns that they're having, and then finding out how those are addressed with the kind of underpinning of the social, like for me, it's socialism and communism, and for others, maybe some other pending ideology. But I think most importantly, it's about the our common humanity. And while we all have unique circumstances and conditions, and that we can't necessarily fully understand those of each other, it's important for us to empathize and to to see ourselves in each other. And when we do that, I think it allows us to recognize that, uh, given all of our shortcomings and the issues that we have a commonality that surpasses that, and that the that commonality is, in my opinion, from the Freudian kind of notion of becoming more fully human, and that means taking control over over the world around us. And so I guess to tie those two things together, what that means is in order to have control over what's happening in your community, you have to be in your community, you have to be engaging with it, and hearing it and listening, and not just uh, speaking online or listening to various podcasts or whatever, but taking that information and that knowledge and practicing it in ways that the sharing becomes a practice, more than and an act, more than, I guess, a an idea. And that's something I need to work on myself, and I continually try and push myself. And admittedly, the pandemic has put a wrench in that for, I think, a lot of people, but it's also opened up a window of sorts for other people to get involved and to be engaged, and to do it perhaps not the very sociable, a lot of talking involved, but really just meeting people's needs, and then people recognizing you when there's the next protest, for the next shooting, or for whatever is going to happen that's going. And when people start to recognize you and identify you as in common cause, and just be supporting and to be supportive, that we reach a point where we are have that kind of active power where we can activate and actually push political change, in the sense of they have no choice but to engage, to change and to act, to satiate the masses rather than to be able to just use kind rhetoric and not ever actually deliver on those promises.
Yeah, well said. As per usual, Richard, you're kind of like the poet of the LeftPOC Project podcast in a lot of ways, and I appreciate that. But way more material. Like, you're grounded in material analysis, but you have a way with words that I think is very artistic, kind of like what we talked about with Mao, right? To bring it full circle, there was a line in there about the artistry of political rhetoric, and I think it applies here as well. So I appreciate that.
Much appreciated.
Yeah. So on that note, everyone, please stay safe. We're looking at really scary numbers right now for COVID. So please protect yourselves and your families, your friends. Make sure you have a mask that, if you can, get a mask that protects you and protects others. So look into N95s, KN95s, and KN94s, because those are the masks that are going to protect both you as the wearer and the other person. Make sure you're also wearing it properly, like check your fit and whatnot. There are videos online to help with that. And I would also say, if you can avoid going indoors anywhere, please do so. Obviously, if you have to, protect yourself through any means necessary. But if you can avoid going in, if you can do grocery store pickup, delivery, if you can, get things delivered. Although, unfortunately, I hate how all of this has been sort of laundered through corporations that do really awful things. But,
yes, tip the workers and make it cash, because a lot of these corporations are known to steal the digital tip. So if you can, tip and tip cash.
Yeah, dude, it's unfortunate.
Hygienic, it's a balance, I guess, protect yourselves as much as you can. Yeah.
Right.
Do what you can.
And if you are working from home, hats off to you. I know it's difficult to do. If you're not working from home, even more difficult. For those of you with kids, even more difficult. So I understand it's a struggle for in this moment right now. And I just know that we support you and understand and are empathetic in a lot of ways. And I just hope that everyone can please stay safe. Christmas is coming up. Hanukkah is ongoing. And, just remember that if you can, this is as some people said, the COVID year, chalk it up to being the COVID year. And the more people that stay home and stay safe, the more of an opportunity we have for reuniting in the future with relatives who are still alive and friends who are still alive. So just please protect yourselves. With that, thanks everyone. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to check out our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/LeftPOC, and to check us out on social media. All of our content is always free. You can find old episodes, reading materials, and the like on the Patreon page, but you can also find this on our social media pages as well. Thanks so much again, Richard. And we'll be back soon with new content. Oh, one more thing. Don't forget to check out, we have the Comrade Mommy episodes that I do individually, but then I'm going to start doing interviews and discussions with different people on as well, where I talk about parenting from a leftist perspective. I think that's everything. I feel like I'm missing something. I always feel like I'm missing something when I do this sort of housekeeping, but I don't know, rate and review.
Yeah, I was just going to say thanks to everyone, all the people that are already supporting on Patreon and any new supporters, and just and all the reviews and kind words. I see them, and I'm not to say anything about them, but I do try to at least like them, and they mean a lot to me when I see people say positive things about what we're doing here. So thank you for that, and thank you for sharing with people and all of that. It's very much appreciated. And thank you, Wendy, of course, as always.
Thanks, Richard. Everyone stay safe, and thanks again. Have a good one. And thank you for listening to the LeftPOC Project podcast. Be sure to check us out on social media and follow us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/LeftPOC, where you can get all of our materials for free, including the podcast, and of course, donate $1 or more per month to keep us afloat. Also, be sure to check us out on any other place where you get podcasts besides the Patreon page. That's SoundCloud, Spreaker, Spotify, iTunes, you name it, we're there. Thanks again.